Great. Okay. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. We have a brilliant lineup of speakers and a very important topic. So let's get started. My name's Fiona. I'm Head of Public Policy here at the Learning Society of Wales. At the Learning Society of Wales, we're no stranger to multi-level governance. As most of our policy engagement involves working with Welsh Government, Senedd committees, but also UK Government and Westminster as well. It's a really complicated landscape, so we're really grateful for today's speakers for their advice and their help in navigating it. So what we're going to do today is to explore the unique challenges and opportunities that arise from doing research across the UK's devolved contexts. And we'll also offer guidance on how you can maximise the impact of your research through policy engagement. Today's webinar is co-organised by the Learning Society of Wales's Early Career Researcher Network and the Scottish Educational Research Association ECR network as well. So we are Wales's National Academy for Sciences, Arts and Humanities, and our ECR network is an interdisciplinary network of researchers working across Wales who are in the early stages of their careers. The network supports researchers to grow their research networks, engage in collaborative and interdisciplinary opportunities, receive training like today, and discover new ways of creating impact with research. The Scottish Educational Research Association Early Career Researcher Network supports ECRs in Scotland to develop their capacity and capabilities as researchers within a supportive network and to share their research, connect with colleagues in education and the broader academic community. They organise monthly events, online or in person, to bring the community together. So this actually isn't our first time working with our counterparts in Scotland. We're part of the Celtic Academies Alliance, which brings together the National Academies of Ireland, Scotland and Wales to encourage cooperation, collaboration and shared learning across the three academic and research systems. The key aims of the Alliance are to provide independent expert advice on shared key issues, to support the evolution of more effective intra-UK and UK-Ireland governance, very relevant for today's topic, and work to ensure that the UK government and its bodies take proper account of the needs and differing situations of the devolved nations, supporting communication and collaboration between the different levels of government. Incidentally, the Celtic Academies Alliance is planning an event on languages in Wrexham on the 29th of April. Registration is going live soon, so keep an eye out for that if you work on languages. And very quickly, I thought I'd also quickly mention the Learning Society also has a Wales Studies network for researchers that are working on any research relating to Wales, which I'm sure is relevant to several of you today. So if your work does involve study in Wales at all, please join us on LinkedIn and or our mailing list. And I'm just about to pop that link in the chat. So we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. We have three brilliant speakers lined up for you, and then we'll have all of the questions at the very end. So you might want to start thinking about questions during the presentations, make a note for yourself, or even just pop it in the chat. So without further ado, our first speaker is Catherine May, who is the lead for external affairs and communications at the Open University's PolicyWise, where she works across the UK and Ireland to translate comparative policy research into accessible insights for policymakers, practitioners, and the public. So Catherine will draw on comparative insights from PolicyWise's research to provide practical guidance on how research-based communications, when embedded early in the policy process, can strengthen public engagement and support evidence-informed decision-making. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm just going to share some slides. Can you have those come up okay? Can everyone see that? Okay.
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Catherine.
Good. Good, thank you very much. Yeah, so thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you very much to the Learned Society for this opportunity to share some of the insights that we've had. Policy-wise has been running for 2 years, and in that time we've met lots of brilliant researchers as well as our work focusing on policymakers. So everything I'm talking about today is information that we've learned from others that we've worked with, and we're really grateful to institute such as Learned Society in Wales for helping us reach people and have some of these really good conversations. Sorry. So what we're going to talk about today is a bit about how to make sure that your research is travelling across some of those borders that might already exist. There's absolutely no doubt that all of you will be doing really good, really useful research. But the question that we're here today to answer is really, how do we help you make sure that research travels across borders? And often it's not always just about the quality, although that's obviously crucial, but about how devolution literate it is. And policy-wise, which I'm going to introduce, exists because most policy questions that you research doesn't stop neatly at national borders. So I'll say a little bit about who Policy-Wise is and why it exists. We're a cross-nation policy research initiative focused on how the governments across all of the UK and Ireland can learn from one another. Particularly focusing on the UK now, the 4 nations of the UK, policy making has become more politically and institutionally diverse, there's no doubt about that. The same policy issues, whether it's health, justice, education, or the cost of living, is often being addressed in different ways in different places at the same time. So the theory of that is that would create huge opportunities for learning, that governments can test different approaches, share evidence, and improve outcomes for citizens. But in practice, that learning doesn't always happen as well as it should. So what is happening in one place and that learning that could be learned from there just gets replicated in another part of the UK and Ireland. And so what policy-wise exists to understand why that learning isn't better and how we can help governments and researchers and policymakers make things work better. So we bring together comparative research roundtables and engagement with policymakers, civil servants, researchers. We're interested in the everyday realities of policymaking in a devolved system, how decisions are made, talking to you all today about how evidence travels and where collaboration breaks down or succeeds. So a key idea underpinning policy-wise is this distinction of what we're talking about today between being devolution aware to being devolution able. All institutions recognise devolution exists, they're all aware of it, but far fewer, our research has found, have the skills, the structures and the relationships needed to work confidently across devolved boundaries as part of normal practice. So that gap about understanding difference and being able to work with it sits at the heart of our research. Because what we think is that if your research hopes to inform policy in the UK, it will always be entering a devolved landscape. And that's really important to start to acknowledge that more explicitly. So when we talk about policy-wise, we're talking about how learning and evidence and collaboration function in that landscape and what it takes to improve that. So this slide sets out a bit about what I'm going to be talking about today. And it's about the shift from being devolution aware to able. As I've said, we all kind of know about political diversity. We know powers are distributed differently, but awareness on its own doesn't help you navigate that diversity in reality. And political diversity isn't just about who's in power. It's also about the different cultures, the policy rhythms, the languages that are used, the ideas about what good evidence or what good policy making looks like. So for researchers, this matters because your work doesn't land into a neutral system. What we find is that the same piece of research can be welcomed in one context, ignored in another, and then completely misunderstood in a different context, simply because of the framing that assumes a single policy making norm. So I think that's the one thing we're really hoping to get across today is the fact that there isn't one way of policy making. There isn't one way of learning that happens. So our comparative research shows that people across governments want to learn from each other. The missing is not motivation, it's capacity. The systems we work in don't consistently reward comparative thinking, cross-boundary learning or shared problem solving. So to summarise, that even when good research exists, there's still work to make sure that it travels and gets to the places where it needs to be. It's hard. This is hard. We recognise that because our systems were not designed for collaboration. And devolution, no doubt, complicates a system that was set up for hierarchy and for very clear, simplistic lines of accountability. Devolution introduces overlap and ambiguity and difference. And those things can feel risky, especially in politicised environments. So for researchers, what we're trying to really help people do is understand that it's better to widen your scope, don't narrow the scope, that single nation framing or planning your impact in a way that avoids complexity means it won't reach the parts that it needs to do. We see common challenges set out across the UK and Ireland about how to frame findings or assumptions about what counts as UK relevant research. And then the practical steps that I'm going to set out about how to move beyond these differences and start to work with them deliberately. So I think some of these practical steps are about asking who else is dealing with this issue? How can I learn from other contexts? And how do I present my work in a way that acknowledges political diversity rather than papering over it? And that's a shift that we're really interested in, from knowing devolution exists to having the skills, structures and mindset to work confidently within it. Policy-wise itself, we deliver research, often with a collaborative piece in mind. This is we've done partners with the University of Cambridge, looking at the new intergovernmental relation structures that have been set up, and making recommendations direct to the governments about how they can work together better to ensure that that policy learning is happening throughout their work. We deliver unique cross-nation policy analysis. Our whys and fives cover a range of different topics. The idea is you can read them in 5. I do know some of them take longer than 5 minutes to read, but it just sounds better to stick to the whys and 5. We're a cross-nation convener for policy and practice. That means we bring together governments, researchers and other interested parties to really look at some of the learning that needs to happen across the different nations and making sure that that happens. We work closely with the government where it's appropriate, leading on issues such as placemaking, violence against women and girls and other key topics. And we bring together researchers and policymakers. The last report on my slide is piece that we wrote on active travel alongside colleagues at Cardiff University, just mapping what's happening in terms of active travel and what lessons could be learnt. So it wouldn't be policy-wise if we didn't do a quiz. So I've got a few questions there. I think it's easiest if we just do them in the chat. So if people can put in the chat the answer to the first question. So you can vote at 16 years old in elections in 2 of the UK parliaments, but which 2? And we'll just leave it for a second. Any thoughts on what that could be? We've had someone come in with B. So that would be Wales and Scotland. Yeah, another one for Wales and Scotland. Okay. Okay. Any other ideas of what it could be? Okay. Great, thank you. So that's our first one. Well done, everybody who braved the chat got it right. It is Wales and Scotland indeed. But I think it's really important to say as well, like there is no wrong or, I mean, there are wrong or right answers, but there is no, this isn't a quiz. We're not like really looking at your ability. What we're trying to demonstrate is how difficult some of these answers are and actually how complicated it is when you get into the context. So the next question looks at Botox. Where is it illegal to have Botox if you're under 18? Again, put your answers in the chat when you've got some thoughts about that. Okay, yeah, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Any more? We'll do another 30 seconds. Any more? Just give it a go. There's no, this is all part of how we learn. So we've had Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales come through. And the answer is actually England. Yeah, it is actually England is the only nation to have legislated that you have to be over 18 to get Botox, which is one of those really interesting things that isn't perhaps what we'd assume, bearing in mind the different makeup of the parliaments that we've had. So that's a good question there. My next question, in which two UK nations do people have a commissioner to uphold their rights? Older people. So the older people's commissioner kind of model that we have. We have those in two of the four UK nations currently. Any guesses on what that might be? Had one. Any more guesses? Anyone else got a guess before I reveal the answer? The answer is C, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the final question. This is one that our director loves to ask people, but I actually still don't get it right every time. But the question is, what are these words used for legislators across Britain and Ireland, but which one originates from the Latin Council of Elders? So you see here we've got the option of the UK Parliament, the Wales Senate, the Northern Ireland Assembly, or the Irish Parliament, the Oireachtas. Any guesses? Okay, good. That'll be D. Any more guesses? D's and B's. The answer is actually B, Senate. So it comes from the word for the same kind of Latin origin as senior and Senate. So yeah, so anyway, that's the end of the quiz. Thank you very much, everybody, for taking part. And I hope that's just helped illustrate a little bit about how complicated some of this stuff is, and that actually, the fact is that things that we think may be particular to a particular way of working a particular parliament, but due to idiosyncrasies or just other changes, they may not be exactly what we thought. And there are lots of learning for all of us really in this area. My next slide just is a little bit of kind of a further kind of background about the different parties that we've had in power over the 25 years of devolution. And we think this one's really interesting because although obviously those of us kind of interested in politics and policy making really reflect on the long kind of conservative rule, actually, if you look at the map across that diagram, you'll see that the Conservatives, that blue block in England, UK, has actually been quite a short period of time relatively compared to the other parties that you can see mapped out on that diagram. And then my next slide. Oh, I don't know why that's not coming up. Shows what the polling has said. I have to be honest, this may not be the latest polling. This was true in November, but there have been many polls in Wales and no doubt in Scotland since then that could have slightly changed it. But it just goes to show the kind of seismic shift that we are looking at, particularly in Wales with the changes in that are being predicted in those elections, but also, in Scotland and in England. And I suppose it just goes to show the importance of mapping our understanding of devolution and policy making across that period of time and across those different parties that have been in positions of power in all of those nations. So now we're going to have a little, I think we'll leave this into the end to talk a bit about policy learning across the governments following the changes in the political leadership. But just for you all to think about that, we've talked a bit about how devolution has led to different policy making, different outcomes in different nations, but then thinking about what might happen next in the next, following the elections in Wales and Scotland. Where do we see this really changing, and where do we see opportunities really for intergovernmental learning to improve, and also challenges where, depending on which parties are successful in the elections, how that could change. So I'm going to talk a little bit now, again, looking back about what could have been different if the UK had been more devolution able. So the collaboration gap is a recurring theme in our comparative research, and it describes the mismatch between what we say we value, cooperation, joined up working, shared learning, and what our systems actually allow. So if we imagine what would have looked different in the UK's policy making if we had been truly devolution able, I mean, the topic that many of us always refer to in this particular issue is, of course, the pandemic, where we saw each government working under huge pressure, making decisions on similar issues and at different times. I know I'm not the only one with a family based in different parts of the UK and Ireland, and the WhatsApp groups would go off and what are you allowed to do? What are you allowed to do? We can do this. And that kind of confusion about what that meant, because the governments weren't at all times working together effectively, meant that people weren't always clear, and that a Devo able system would have allowed greater information sharing, consistent communication strategies, and a greater sense of trust between the governments. People also talk about the cost of living response, where devolved and local authorities innovated rapidly to support communities. But with stronger cross-government coordination, some of those lessons could have been shared and scaled faster. I think for us, we will talk about devolution able doesn't mean uniformity or central control. It means building trusted systems that allow differences to exist with coordination. It's about creating systems for learning, not waiting for the crisis to force a cooperation. So when I do this session for civil servants and decision makers, I try and encourage them to think of the collaboration gap as both a challenge and an opportunity, a space where they can redesign how governments relate to one another. But because today we're meeting as researchers, I think perhaps we might reflect on how the collaboration gap often perhaps shows up as duplicated studies, partial evidence bases, or impact plans that land only in one government and don't have that cross-governmental reach that we're really hoping to get. So what would being devolution able actually mean? So it's a phrase that we use at PolicyWise to describe the capacity of governments, civil servants, institutions to work confidently and systematically across devolved boundaries. It's not about who holds what powers, and that's why the relevance of the political parties shifting is important, but how we operate within those structures. So being devolution aware is understanding, and devolution able is about having skills, structures, and relationships to collaborate effectively across them. So we talk about structures, regular formalised space for dialogue. This isn't ad hoc committees or reactionary task force, but we would like to see the governments have standing arrangements that make cooperation part of how governments work day to day. It's about skills, again, what we call devolution literacy, not only how powers differ, but how decisions are made, communicated and implemented in other parts of the UK. And it's about mindset, about treating difference as a resource, not a problem. Recognising there is value in divergence and that learning across contexts leads to better outcomes for citizens. When governments are devolution able, collaboration should be something that is routine, that is baked into how they work on a daily basis when delivering and developing policies. So I'm going back to the cosmetic procedures to talk a bit about this as an example of how different our policy landscapes are. So you'll see there the difference between those. And this has come from one of our Wise in 5 documents, those briefings that look across all the different parts of the UK and Ireland and summarise what the current policy setup is. And this one will need changing, actually, because Scotland is currently integrating some legislation that will be setting out some changes in Scotland. It's just one example, this one, but it tells of a bigger story about how policy differences work across the UK and Ireland. And it's a reflection of devolution working as intended. It's really important to say this was always the plan, that each nation would be able to have the legislation and the rules and the guidance that fit with what they want for their nation. But it does mean that civil servants, researchers, policymakers have to be adept at navigating complexity. So it's not just about your own policy environment, but looking at what's happening in other places and being curious enough to learn from that. And the importance of considering comparative study design to your work when you're planning your research, thinking about how you can bring in comparative study in there. So it's not about the diversity, that's not the challenge, that's not the difficulty, but it is about our ability to connect those differences and share the insight across the boundaries. So what have we learned so far? From our cross-nation work, we've been really clear, everyone we meet, all the different policymakers and researchers and other kind of interested parties, there's a big desire to collaborate, to learn from each other. We held roundtables across Wales, Scotland, Ireland and England, and participants told us the same thing, that they really want to learn. There is an appetite for cooperation, but the systems and incentives still push them back into those silos. They don't always feel able to reach the research that would help them develop the policies within their context. Um, this is the heart of the challenge, is how do we turn that kind of collaboration into longer term capability? And how do we make working across borders part of the normal cycle, not an exception for crisis? And so as researchers, it's an opportunity to ask yourself, where in your research would this collaboration be useful? Where would it be helpful to bring in this learning, but it isn't currently part of how you're developing your research? So I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of our overall findings as we've kind of gone across the nations to speaking to them about how they learnt in the 25 years of devolution. So in Wales, participants told us about innovation without recognition. So there is a real opportunity for Wales to lead on progressive policy. So from the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that we talk about to organ donation reform and the 20 miles per hour limit. But these examples aren't always acknowledged elsewhere, and that lack of visibility limits opportunities for shared learning. There's also a bit of a sense in Wales that there's almost having to explain why things are being done differently rather than it just being accepted that that's a decision that's being made there. There's almost an assumption that what happens in the UK and the England government is the norm, and what happens in Wales has to be explained if it's different, and that then holds people back from talking more about what they're doing. In Scotland, people told us that they were calling for balanced perspective. They wanted participants told us they wanted collaboration to focus less on constitutional debate and more on practical problem solving, but also a sense almost of Anglophobia, a hesitancy to learn from England because of that fractured political relationships in the history. In Northern Ireland, people told us a lot about the unique context that clearly happens there. The political environment there is distinct. The fact that the power sharing government has previously collapsed and there have been periods without a government means people are very keen to hold on to what they've got to make it work. But there are issues with inconsistent data, fragmented institutions and undeveloped intergovernmental channels. But there is a strong commitment to partnership. And then in England, there's a really strong sense of unfinished business. Devolution is really patchy in England, different powers and responsibilities across combined authorities, city regions, and this can make it really difficult to establish clear communication with devolved governments and even harder to coordinate on cross-cutting issues. So across all of the nations, people told us that they wanted to collaborate, but they felt the systems and the cultures made that difficult. So when we talk about what stops it working, some of the issues that they told us was a sense of defensive competition, defensive communication dynamics. So a sense that governments approach collaboration from a stance of protection rather than curiosity, defending their own policy choices rather than exploring others, and that this can make genuine learning difficult. There's still a sense that, as I said, Westminster is treated as default setting and everyone else is the exception. Welsh and Scottish officials talked about having to explain or justify policy differences, and English participants admitted that they miss innovations because they're not seen as directly relevant, and that mindset makes learning much harder. There's an issue around data incomparability. Each government collects and publishes data in different ways, and the result is we can't always compare results. In Northern Ireland, they told us there's a real issue with different timing around data collection, and that makes it very frustrating then when the league tables are published and actually they're not accurate in terms of demonstrating how the different nations are doing. Institutional fragmentation was also an issue people told us about. Relationships between governments depend too much on individuals rather than stable systems. When people move on, the connection breaks down. And then finally, that limited devolution literacy. That confusion, even held by some officials, between UK-wide responsibility with England only. And that blurring creates confusion and sometimes mistrust. We have, there is not all bad news. There is good news. Really good examples of devolution policy learning. The Human Transplantation Act in Wales. This was opt-out or organ donation reform, required collaboration across UK-wide health systems, and integrating research the whole way through the policy cycle with shared communication and planning led to national impact and has continued to be a real learning point for the other nations. Also Scotland, the minimum unit pricing for alcohol. Scotland went first with this really interesting and bold or controversial policy. And there was real pushback on it, but actually the implementation has provided valuable evidence on the health and social effects of pricing intervention, which has then helped that data, that information has informed debates in Wales and Northern Ireland, and even public health discussions in parts of England. So I think what we're talking about is it's not always about just the idea itself, but the willingness with which nations share their evidence and learning. And then also Greater Manchester's devolution deal is a really interesting example of how greater devolution can be done. The willingness to document the successes and the challenges has made that really helpful for others in the UK. Finally, just to talk quickly about the structure. So we know that there's not enough just to have informal goodwill. We need structural learning structures that set out how research can be built into the different governments. We need learning culture change so that policymakers develop a good understanding of comparative methods. And we also need to start sharing those success stories systematically and across the board. So here's the 7 steps that we talk about how to get what does good look like. It'll be interesting kind of hearing any reflections on these. For researchers, we talk a lot about mapping your policy territory, just developing that understanding of who is developing the policy, who is responsible for the different policy, who are the actors in those nations, and where are the opportunities for you to feed that research in. And it's great that we've got speakers today who'll tell us a little bit about where some of those opportunities are, because generally policymakers are really keen to hear what it is that you've got to share, and also to bring together those regular cross-nation learning exchanging, that sharing of what works. So I think it would be helpful as well. I won't, I think as Fiona said, we'll come back to this at the end, but a bit about what do you think good would look like when you're designing, framing or communicating your research in a devolved landscape? Do you want to do that at the end, Fiona?
So at the end is Q&A. It's an opportunity for the participants to ask their questions. So it depends on kind of how you're planning to how you're planning to work on this. And we've still got that's 9 minutes.
9 minutes. Okay. Well, should we see if people have got thoughts that they want to bring in now, if that's okay? This was a question that I kind of came up with that I thought would be helpful, but if others have got other thoughts or ideas they'd like to feed in, I'd love to hear a bit about your research and how it applies within a kind of devolved context. So yeah, over to the participants. Anyone to put a hand up? I don't know what the best way to do this is. No? Okay. Am I doing this right? Am I seeing? I'm not missing anyone.
I can't see anyone. Yeah, I think people are feeling a little bit shy. We could
Okay.
ask people if they want to pop their thoughts in the chat instead.
Okay, no problem. So I'll just talk finally, summarise a bit about what we've actually learned, kind of thing, and what hopefully the messages that will come across as kind of just to kind of summarise the presentation today. So one of the most important findings is that the desire to collaborate is there, that people told us at all levels of government they want to learn from each other and from researchers, but the system doesn't always make it easy. So this really matters because it means that when it's not about a lack of interest in your work, it's about limited time, unclear structures or uncertainty about how evidence travels across government. It's about being really clear with your research who it is that you think that this could help. and who it could support, and how they could learn from the research and develop that into their policy making. We learned about how collaboration tends to kind of flourish under pressure. During the pandemic, government did share information, data, and policy ideas because of the urgency forced new ways of working. But as researchers, that's not how we work. We can't rely on crises to make collaboration possible, because once the immediate pressure fades, those channels can close again. So it's really important to look for those other opportunities to feed your research into those kind of governments and parliament structures. It's about developing the tools, habits, and confidence to work across the different governments. So it's thinking about how your collaboration could be valuable, but isn't yet designed in. And then that might be about how you define your research question and how you describe your policy relevance, making sure that it is actually chiming with the different audiences, and how your impact plan shows that that could feed in. So it's a research challenge, really, isn't it? So that moving simply from kind of knowing that devolution exists and seeing that policy variation as a research opportunity and not as a complication, I think is a really, really exciting opportunity. And that's why I was really pleased to come along today and share that. My final slide has our contact details, and it has my email on there, and I'd love to hear from any of you. And I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was so insightful. I'm sure everybody has loads of questions, so don't forget to note them down. You can pop them in the chat, because we'll be having the Q&A all at the very end of the session. Okay, so our next two speakers will share their insights and provide practical advice on engaging with the Scottish and Welsh parliaments through their research. So Mary McQuaid is the head of educational policy and leadership research and teaching group at Glasgow University. Sorry, Mary will share her experience of engaging with the Scottish government through her current PhD research. And Gareth is a lecturer in law at Swansea University, where he coordinates modules on the law of devolution in Wales. So Gareth will share his experiences of researching the devolution settlement in Wales and engaging with politicians and Senedd researchers. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to try and share my slides. We did practice this. I'm hoping it works this time. Go to this one, share. So I just have 10 minutes of a quick overview of the work that I'm doing. Are the slides okay there, Fiona? Can you see them properly? Super, thank you.
They are, well done.
Lovely. So good morning, everybody. My name is Mary McQuaid. I am a lecturer in childhood practice, which is a uniquely Scottish sector. And it covers leadership and management in care and education sectors in Scotland. I'm going to give you a bit of a whistle-stop tour of my research and some insights from my work that might be helpful if you're thinking or planning to engage with policymakers in Scotland. So part of my background, I'm currently a PhD candidate exploring stakeholder influence in policy development in Scotland, again, with a focus on care and education, which is a sector that I've worked in for a long time. But prior to joining the University of Glasgow, I was a civil servant working in the policy profession in the Scottish Government. So with both hats on at times, I'm kind of hoping to give you just some insights into both sides of that research-government relationship, some ideas about how I've gone about conducting the research, but also just a little bit of an overview of some of the structures that you'll come across if you decide you want to engage with government and policy colleagues in Scotland. So seeing both sides, as a civil servant, you're like acutely aware of the tight timelines that people work under, that ministerial kind of requests are, I need this by 4 o'clock this afternoon, not go off and spend 3 weeks looking into something and come back with some good lines on it. Quite often they're looking for really kind of quite tight turnarounds, always focused on ministerial priorities, which can change with the flip of a coin, depending on what's going on in the world and what different pressures are happening. And there's a real need for kind of political acuity, for that awareness of how you balance what the political voices are, what the media voices are, what the voices of the people in the country are, and do all of that while trying to engage with the research that helps inform policy. So civil servants are in a really kind of complex, pressured area. So when they want to deal with researchers, they quite often are looking for people that they have a relationship with, that they can call quickly, that they can get advice from quickly. So there's a lot of work to be done in not engaging once, but in building up a kind of longer term relationship with anybody who works in policy. As a policy researcher on the other side, obviously, we're looking for depth, we're looking for independent thinking, we're looking to critique what's going on. And as a researcher looking to engage with policy, I think one of the really key things is translating between those two worlds, is being able to have the depth of your research, but the ability to engage quickly, to respond quickly, to engage regularly with policy, with the policy profession and with ministers about the areas that they're interested in. I think that kind of translation between the two institutional kind of logics can be really challenging. So that's kind of where my background comes from. And I would just say, as a thing that is useful if you are a researcher looking at policy, make yourself aware of the Civil Service Code. It's all published, it's all out there, but it will give you an idea of what policymakers can and cannot engage with, how they can engage with you, where they're allowed to be involved. And that kind of helps you set up your idea of how you engage with them. Make the slides move on. Why can't I make the slides move on? There we go. So just as a kind of brief case study and overview, I'll tell you a little bit about the work that I'm doing at the moment. I am halfway through a PhD. I'm doing it part-time while working full-time as a university lecturer, so juggling all the balls on the evenings and the weekends mostly. But I'm looking at stakeholder influence in the design of new care and education policy in Scotland. So looking at where voices are heard, where they're missing, who engages, how they're encouraged to be kind of part of the system, and how different stakeholders, including policymakers, including advocacy groups, service providers, etc., how they perceive their roles and their influence in the development and implementation of I'm looking at school-age childcare policy in Scotland. It's a fast-moving area of policy development. It's influenced by national and international research, but particularly by national priorities in Scotland, in particular the tackling child poverty agenda. So that's the kind of area that I'm working in. And I guess I wanted to give you a little overview of who I engaged with and how, and how that has worked for me, where the challenges have been. In addition to kind of sharing research reports, presentations, literature review, key findings, which I try and do kind of regularly with policy colleagues and just show them where my research is kind of growing and what direction it's going in. I also try and engage with them with my university hat on. I share that if we've got webinars coming up that they might find interesting, if we've got policy discussions, if we have professional learning that's in their area, I try and stay involved and say, oh, you might want to come along to this. The University of Glasgow is hosting someone from Finland to talk about early years. Would any of your early years colleagues like to come? And actually try and have a kind of symbiotic relationship where it's not always, please listen to me. I'd really like you to listen to me about my research, that actually you have a relationship where you're inviting them to things that might help with their professional learning and their understanding of the world that's out there. So having done that kind of over the past couple of years, there's been opportunities to engage formally and informally with Scottish Government officials who are designing policy, with local government officials who are implementing policy, as well as with the stakeholders in the education and care sector who are trying to influence the policy. So having the ear of all of those different people mean that if a question comes up and they say, oh, we should speak to some researchers about that, they go, oh, Mary, she's working in that area. You know, you've bedded yourself into a community rather than just trying to get your voice heard with one policymaker or one policy team. So there's something about kind of being visible and present in the wider space that you're interested in, just to build up your own kind of persona and people's understanding of who you are. For me, what's worked so far is as I had very early engagement with policymakers across the Scottish Government and local government. And as I say, I've kept that up through kind of informal communications. I've tried to be really clear with my messaging, really clear about what I'm doing, what I'm interested in, why I'm interested in it. Because what I'm hoping for the impact of my research is about influencing thinking, not just changing policy, but informing development, informing the ways that policy is developed, informing how stakeholders are engaged with. I think there have been challenges, and there are always challenges in working with policymakers. And I think understanding, as going back to some of the things that Catherine said, understanding the ebb and flow of the year for people who work within politics, within the civil service. Think about policy officials having different conversations and priorities in a pre-election period, which is the obvious one. But they'll also be interested in specific things during a manifesto writing period where there's a bit more blue sky thinking happening. Or when a programme for government, what they're going to do in the upcoming year, is being designed and developed. There are different conversations happening then and different opportunities to feed in. The pre-budget period is an immense pressure. In Scotland, our budget was just come out last week, and all the civil servant colleagues that I know, they were getting phone calls on Boxing Day. So there are huge pressures on the people that are there, and they're needing to turn around evidence and thinking and ideas so quickly. And just being aware of those spaces and times throughout the year, I think, can be really, really valuable. So I'm just going to go I've got about 4 minutes left. I'm going to go through a few slides that just touch on some of the ideas that you might want to think about if you are looking to engage with Scottish politicians or Scottish civil servant. I think it's a different space if you're used to working with the UK government. As Catherine said, devolution isn't just a constitutional detail. It kind of fundamentally shapes how policy is made, how evidence is used. And Scotland can feel complex at first because it's been set up so differently to the UK government. But actually, the smaller system often means better access for researchers, better relationships, and more knowledge of what's happening within the system, because civil servants move around, policy teams move around. People could be working in fisheries one year and then working in healthcare workforce the next year. And actually keeping track and keeping those relationships going can be really challenging. But the smaller system means that there is more transparency and there is more opportunity to find out who the people are that you need to engage with. In Scotland, healthcare and education, which are the two areas that not healthcare, so care and education are the two areas that I work in, are two of the devolved areas. So that makes kind of Scotland a particularly important context for my research. And Scottish policy debates, values, evidence needs, etc., can often differ quite remarkably from the UK government discussions. Catherine mentioned about kind of multi-level governance that emphasises how policy making operates differently and across different territories, and how important it is to be kind of aware of that, because devolution doesn't only shape the formal responsibilities, but also the kind of cultures that underpin the timelines, the expectations. Scotland is often described as kind of an accessible policy system, because one of the kind of the themes of the SNP government that we've had in place, as you've seen, for quite a long time now, one of their themes has been about kind of being consultative, being relational, trying to be really visible in their policy development and trying to engage with stakeholders at all levels. So that kind of legislative and strategic autonomy that comes with the devolution means that there are sometimes different trajectories that you've got to be really aware of. With my research, I've been looking at how childcare policy has been developed and implemented in all 4 regions of the UK, as well as elsewhere. But more than anything, I would just say, like, all of the literature, all of the research cautions against treating Scotland as a scaled down version of Westminster, because it works just really differently. If you are thinking about kind of taking some of your research and engaging with Scottish policymakers, the policy teams are organised differently. They're organised around delivery and ministerial priorities rather than disciplines. The economists don't all sit together. The people don't all sit in kind of disciplinary areas. So very much you find out the people who are working on your policy area, and you could be dealing with analysts, you could be dealing with economists, you could be dealing with policy professionals, and they're all working together as a team. So kind of, again, understanding those kind of institutional arrangements can be really useful for effective engagement. In the UK, government policy tends to be faster and more centralised and a bit more directive. In Scotland, it's often slower because of the consultation kind of demands, and these are quite often in legislation. And the other thing is, if you're dealing with a policy team, there might only be 3 or 4 people in it, and they all know each other. So if you can tap into one of them, you are getting to the heart of the policy making in that particular area. Again, it's a smaller country, it's a smaller civil service, and it's much more kind of centralised that way. I think the other thing that I would say, in particular in dealing with Scotland, is that influence doesn't require contacting very senior people. Look for the people organising consultations, look for the people attending events, organising networks or advisory groups. Policy officials, analysts are often the most engaged with evidence, and those kind of networks are really good spaces to get into initial conversations. But you can also email ministers directly, because that's worked for me, with offers to connect with them or their policy officials. So if you contact a minister and they're not going to meet with you, it'll get sent to the policy team, and the policy team will quite often say, oh, that's an area that I'm really interested in, or we've been looking for more research on that, or we need to connect with new people who are working on that area. I think my biggest takeaway from working as a researcher and working with governments, but also as a civil servant previously, is that the civil service are desperate to get in touch with you. You don't have to apologise for it. You don't have to say, excuse me, would you mind listening to what I've done? They are super keen to hear from you. They want to know what research is going on in the field that they're supposed to be experts in. And they want to connect with the expertise of the research that are out there. They want to know who's researching in their policy area. Policy professionals specialise in policy development, not in the specific policy area. So they are looking to create networks that they can kind of tap into to ask questions, interrogate information, and make links to the real world context. So you're not banging against a closed door. There are various places beyond government, committees, cross-party groups that are worth engaging with. COSLA in Scotland, which is the coalition for Scottish local authorities, is a really powerful player. So again, speaking to people within COSLA can get you access to wider policy networks. Finding out who the COSLA representative is for your area of interest can be really valuable. So I'll finish up really quickly because I think I've probably gone over a minute or two. Sorry, Fiona. In Scotland, evidence really matters, but it matters most when it fits the kind of values, the timing, and the relationships within the policy system. So, it aims to be highly consultative and accessible, but it is still political. That will never go away from that space. But there should be opportunities to engage if you can get into those tight policy communities that exist. Access is easier, but reputations last. So, just be professional, be kind of aware that you might be working with these people for a long time if you want to stay in the field. There is a real emphasis on co-production, participation, lived experience, along with other research evidence. And it's really, especially within education, it's very highly kind of values-led and politicised and closely tied to national identity. Kind of free education in Scotland through to kind of university education, etc., is something that's really, really core. So just, I guess, for me, I think what I found is that the impact that you can have and the impact that you can evidence of your research and the dissemination that you can evidence often comes with alignment with kind of values as well as with the findings that you have. And that timeliness, the ability to respond quickly if you do have a call for evidence or a call for discussion, often matters a lot more than what journals you've published in. People in government want somebody that they can call, they can speak to, that they can talk about ideas with, that they can be transparent with, and that they can respond to quickly. So that would be my experience from my own research so far. I'm still drowning in data analysis at the moment, but getting there. If anybody would like to know more about that, please get in touch with me here or on LinkedIn. I've put a few references on the slides that might be useful for anybody who's interested in that, but otherwise I will stop sharing my slides and say thank you very much. I hope I did that in time.
Thanks so much, Mary. That was so interesting. Loads of brilliant insights there. I'll pass straight over to Gareth.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll just share my slides and put those in presenter mode. Okay. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Gareth. I'm a lecturer in law at Swansea University. I specialise in the teaching and research mainly about constitutional matters in relation to devolution in Wales. I'm going to talk about that a little bit today, about my experience of working with people aligned to the devolved institutions in Wales, to sort of use my research, but also to get insights from them, which will then feed into my research as well. So a little bit of context to start off about what is devolution in Wales and what are the institutions that you can engage with. So firstly, the two main ones and the ones which we see most in the news are the Senedd and the Welsh Government. These are the legislature and the executive, sort of the main institutions at the heart of the devolution settlement in Wales. But in terms of engagement, an awful lot of the engagement with my own work and my work of colleagues actually comes through the wider committee structure within the Senedd. There's 17 committees in total at the moment. They're generally aligned to a specific portfolio area. There'll be regular calls for evidence during the normal cycle. You can sign up to mailing lists through the Senedd Research Service, which will tell you when there's updated calls for evidence. And it's a really good way to start that initial engagement, to send off your findings and respond to that, and to show as to how you can feed it within that space. Outside of that as well is also the Senedd research team. These are members of the wider civil service. They are there to gather research and to produce research reports. They can be really good people to connect with to learn about what the Senedd is doing. You can use their work in your research, but you can also, the other way, feed your research into their work and to inform their practice as well. And specifically as well within that wider devolution space, if you've got a specific subject area that has a wider professional network that you can engage with, that's also a really fruitful way to start that initial engagement. So I'm a law lecturer, so I engage mainly with legal practitioners who are working within the space of the UK's devolution settlement, work with them on matters relating to devolution, and they're a really good way as well of bridging that gap outside of academia into the policy or the wider practical sphere, to get your research out there and to get your research heard. Building on what's already been said today, really, the specific nature of devolution in Wales, the way in which the devolution settlement was designed, and the architecture of the Senedd itself is designed to be more of a collaborative and accessible form of government. So it's more collaborative in the sense of it's very, very reliant on the work of the committees, and you can feed your work in there, but also in terms of wider consultation. There are multiple access points you can engage with the government and wider bodies aligned to government in Wales, and would really sort of encourage that if you've got those within your professional area. Another one as well is it's generally more flexible. We've seen within the first aspect of the presentation today, a lot of devolved policy making is sometimes slightly ahead of the curve. If we look at it within a wider UK landscape, generally some of the policies can be slightly more progressive. So if you've got some new research as well, I've found that it's also that they're generally more open to listen as well at the devolved level. And as already been mentioned as well, there's generally a much smaller pool of academics focusing on region-specific areas of research. So particularly in Wales, I've found that there's a relatively small pool of academics working in my area. And we are a good network ourselves. You can build up connections within the academic community, and if one academic can't meet something, they will send it across to colleagues. So that's a good way to build that network. I've found as well, so find people in your area who are sort of aligned with the same research. But also as well, when you start that initial engagement, as was mentioned in the previous presentation, once you build that connection, you'll generally be more open to being contacted in future. One thing to mention in a specific Welsh context, though, is Wales does have a narrower scope of legislative competence. So what that means is the Senedd has a narrower scope in what it can actually make law on, if we compare it to the Scottish Parliament or to the Northern Ireland Assembly. That has its advantages and disadvantages. To some extent, there's less initial points of engagement, but also the wider debates that are going on in Wales about future devolution. If you're working, I've seen in the chat some people working on sort of justice compass and the jagged edge. That's a continuous rolling debate within Wales about the future devolution of powers in that area. Myself, I'm working on stuff relating to the devolution of the Crown Estate, and policymakers, they want to hear about these ideas at both levels of government. At Westminster as well, there's currently legislation going through about aspects of devolution. So you can engage at both levels. If you've got research which is informing that design of potential devolution or saying against potential risks of devolution of power, you can feed into that space as well. In terms of how I engage in my own practice, sort of the first one is fairly outputs focused. So based on the research that I produce, the journal articles and these sort of things, try and disseminate it as much as you can. So on LinkedIn is a really good example. Have a really good staff profile. If you've got a staff profile, if you're still a PhD candidate, if you've got some form of external presence, and having a research repository online as well, that somewhere someone can access your research quite easily if you're not directly sending it to them. If they find your name somewhere, they can go and find your research and have it fairly accessible. Responding as well to those calls for evidence from committees, from wider investigations, from NGOs. A lot of them will often be investigating a particular devolution issue. So if you can respond to those calls as well, it helps to build that network up. And one thing which I've started doing in the last few years is to publish within this broader aspect of what is now starting to be termed aspects of grey literature, which refers mainly to academic blogs, but also writing for the conversation, writing for newspapers, these sort of things. It's where it's got a degree, it's still got a degree of academic authority to it, but it's slightly more accessible to the reader, it's slightly shorter, and it's also something that you can quickly send to a policymaker to say, oh, actually, I've written something in this area, here it is, and then maybe you can send your further research later on. So it helps in building those initial connections as well. Relationship focused as well. This is about crafting those networks within the devolved space. The way that I've sort of learned from colleagues to approach it is with a degree of humility and understanding that as an expert in your area, after you've done your PhD, you will know an awful lot about your area, but also entering that policy space, there are also new things which you will learn, and sort of a broader political landscape which your research is going to be informing. Building networks with those professionals and those policymakers, attending events outside of purely academic events themselves. So not just conferences. I myself attend a lot of events within the broader legal sector, attending networking events in Cardiff, for example, attending public lectures where you can get to meet people who are working in the same area as you. As well as just contacting people as well, contacting members by email, contacting members of the research service or policymakers by email to say that you've got research within this particular area. Sometimes it doesn't lead to anything, but sometimes it does lead to some really good connections. One thing which has informed sort of my own practice is understanding this idea of a policy window and when it can actually open up. There's a lot of stuff within academia about impact and impact linked to informing policy, but actually it's a very sort of narrow window when you can actually influence original policy. That actually the only two things we can control as academics is aspects of the problem, so we can map in our research what the problem is, or we can pose a broader set of ways of or workarounds to that problem, and we can influence that in highlighting it in our research, and we can influence the wider policy sector as well in terms of identifying maybe potential workarounds for an issue. But we can't really do much about is the wider political screen in this aspect as well. Okay, we can't really change that. We need to be aware of it though. And one thing within my own research, which I do, is to be aware of what the political landscape is like, be aware of political issues which are arising. As I mentioned, researching issues in a devolved context where there may be some debate about future devolution or amendments to the devolution settlement or new policies coming about in a manifesto, being aware of that, and then you can sometimes align your research within those areas to influence if that policy window does come about. Some examples then of where this has actually sort of worked in practice. For me, the first one was working back in the times of COVID. I got my PhD in 2019, and the next year we locked down. My PhD was looking mainly at territorial governance from a legal perspective. And as has been mentioned, one thing during COVID is governments sometimes weren't that good at working together during certain points of the pandemic. So I identified a problem. It was sort of a well-publicized problem, was able to align that then in the way that I produced research, which bridged the gap between the academic theory I was aware of, but also the wider practical constraints around COVID and around intergovernmental relations. Published that work. It was about a 5,000 word paper. And that has led to some really, really good engagement afterwards. Have sent that to people within the policy sector. They've been really interested in that. It's led to being invited to give calls for evidence to wider committees and to wider inquiries. So actually having that research that sometimes just through pure luck, it aligned at a certain policy window where there was an issue, a problem, and I was able to produce research within that area. On top of that, though, sort of having those professional networks and working with people within the policy sector or within the governance sector, they can also make you aware of aspects of the research landscape. So an example of a current project I've got ongoing is looking at legislative scrutiny within the Senedd. And I learnt about this issue through engaging with members of the Senedd research service, sometimes on an informal basis, just having conversations, saying what they were working on at the moment. And I got to learn about an area which hadn't been that widely publicized and I wasn't really that aware of within my area of practice. And then was able to be directed to the literature which helped my research, and now my research is sort of informing wider practice as well and being used in that area. So that shows by having those networks and building those networks, it can really help and inform. And the final one is being aware of that political landscape. So awareness of the fact that there are a number of parties now within Wales who are looking at devolution of additional powers. The example I use is the Crown Estate, but there's multiple other areas as well. There's rail transportation, justice, broadcasting. If you're working within these spaces and you can find aspects of policymakers, people who write manifestos, etc., you can be aware and align your research to that area. And that's something I've done recently with producing initially just grey literature blogs that were looking at this issue. And then that's gone on to peer-reviewed articles as well, which are sort of in the pipeline now, looking at a comparison between Wales, which currently doesn't have devolution of the Crown Estate, and Scotland, which does. So it allows for working across those devolved policy spaces as well, to understand how they work and how they operate. But I think I am coming up to time, so I will stop talking and I will hand back to everyone else. So any questions, please do drop them in the chat or feel free to get in touch. Thanks.
Beautiful timing. Thank you so much, Gareth and Mary. I was nodding furiously during both of those presentations. I'm sure many others were. So we're just going to end the recording now ahead of Q&A.